I never thought a single sentence could feel like a punch to the gut. One evening, after months of subtle tension that I had tried to ignore, my mom yelled, sharp and unrelenting, "If you're so smart, then pay your own bills." Pause. For a moment, I just froze, staring at her in disbelief. My chest tightened, my mind raced, and it felt like the floor beneath me had vanished. I had been working endlessly, saving every penny I could, trying to help wherever possible. I had thought my efforts would earn at least a hint of appreciation. Apparently, I was wrong. Apparently, no amount of sacrifice could make a difference. Her words weren't just criticism, they were a challenge, a declaration that my independence would only come when I proved myself, not in ways of growth, but in monetary terms. Wandered to the bathroom and stared at my reflection, beat, trying to process the sting of betrayal. Was I overreacting? Was this really about money, or something deeper? The mirror didn't answer. All I saw was a mix of anger, confusion, and disbelief staring back at me. I realized I had two choices: sink under the weight of guilt and frustration, or stand up and find a way to prove my worth, not for her, but for myself. That night, a spark ignited inside me. Pause. Fear danced alongside determination. The thought of stepping into a life of self-reliance was terrifying, but for the first time, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Everything I had taken for granted, my energy, my time, my money, suddenly seemed like tools I could wield to carve out a new path. Little did I know, her words were only the beginning of a storm that would reshape my entire life. Growing up, I was always labeled the smart kid in my family. It was a badge I wore, but also a burden I carried silently. Expectations hovered over me like a constant cloud. I was supposed to excel without complaint, to be perfect in ways that often felt impossible. I graduated early from school, took on part-time jobs, and tried to contribute wherever I could, but acknowledgement was rare. Praise was fleeting, and every effort seemed to be measured against some invisible standard that I could never fully meet. Pause. I loved my mom deeply, but our relationship had always been complicated. She was strict, opinionated, and her approval felt like currency I could never earn. Money had always been a source of tension between us. Even when I tried to ease the burden, I often felt invisible, my hard work dismissed or overlooked. I watched her roll her eyes at my small victories, dismiss my suggestions, and casually assume that if left alone, I would inevitably fail. These little moments added up, building a quiet resentment I rarely voiced. Outside the home, my life was different. Friends, school, and part-time jobs offered opportunities and recognition that I didn't receive at home. I thrived in those spaces, yet I carried an invisible weight back into our house every evening. The argument that night crystallized everything I had been feeling for years. The shouting, the accusation, it was more than a financial dispute. It revealed a deeper imbalance, a dynamic where my worth seemed conditional, measured against obedience or usefulness rather than who I truly was. Beat, as I replayed her words in my mind, I realized I had been living in someone else's shadow for far too long. My accomplishments, my intelligence, my ability to plan and contribute, none of it had been fully recognized. And now, staring at the aftermath of our confrontation, I understood that respect and freedom weren't going to be handed to me. If I wanted them, I would have to claim them myself. I would have to step out of the shadows and redefine what it meant to be smart, not according to her standards, but by my own. But stepping out meant risking everything I had ever known, my comfort, my sense of belonging, and the fragile sense of security I had always taken for granted. The decision was terrifying, yet exhilarating. And as I sat there that night, grappling with the weight of choice, I felt the first flicker of resolve begin to take root. The next morning, her words were still echoing in my mind. If you're so smart, then pay your own bills. At first, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief, but slowly, that frustration morphed into something else. Paying my own bills stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like a mission, a challenge I was determined to meet on my own terms. Sat down at my small desk, opened my laptop, and began reviewing my finances. Every dollar in my bank account suddenly felt like a weapon, a tool I could use to carve out independence. I counted my savings, projected upcoming expenses, and made mental notes about how far it could stretch. I researched job opportunities, looking for side hustles and part-time gigs that could supplement my main income. At the same time, I explored living arrangements, small apartments, roommates, or even renting a room temporarily. Every option seemed daunting, yet strangely liberating. Fear gnawed at me constantly. What if I failed? What if my plan collapsed in the first month? But beneath the anxiety, excitement bubbled. For the first time, I felt like I was taking control. This wasn't about proving anything to my mom, it was about proving to myself that I was capable. That I could stand on my own, make decisions, and survive without relying on anyone else's approval. I started documenting everything quietly. Receipts, payment schedules, notes about my contributions to the household over the years, they all went into a small folder. Every decision became deliberate. Every choice I made now carried weight. Every little action was a step toward freedom, and I began to see how much I had sacrificed without recognition. I realized how little she had appreciated the effort, the time, and the patience I had poured into trying to maintain peace. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be financial pressure, emotional stress, and the weight of stepping into the unknown. But I couldn't stay trapped in a cycle of guilt, blame, and manipulation any longer. This moment marked a clear division in my life, a line between before and after. I felt like I had drawn my first map toward independence. Every night, as I lay awake planning the next steps, I felt the spark of determination growing brighter. But just as I thought I had a clear plan, an unexpected obstacle appeared, one that threatened to derail everything I had worked to prepare. Going independent sounded liberating in theory, but reality hit me faster than I expected. My savings, which I had painstakingly accumulated, barely covered the first month's rent and essential bills. Pause. I remember staring at the numbers on my laptop and realizing that any mistake could send me spiraling. The safety net I thought I had felt paper thin. I picked up extra shifts wherever I could in cafes, freelance gigs, and odd jobs that left my body aching and my mind constantly drained. Balancing work, bills, and the hope of stability became a relentless test of endurance. I often came home late, exhausted and lonely, the silence of my small apartment amplifying the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. Every day felt like a mental obstacle course. Meanwhile, the sting of judgment from my mom and other family members was sharp. When they realized I was serious about leaving, whispers, sighs, and subtle criticisms followed me wherever I went. Friends tried to warn me about the difficulties ahead, their voices full of concern, but I refused to back down. I knew this was my moment to prove something, to myself, more than anyone else. Bills piled up quickly, and minor emergencies kept cropping up. The water heater broke, the refrigerator needed attention, and groceries cost more than I had anticipated. Fear of failure shadowed every choice I made, constantly reminding me of the fragile nature of independence. I questioned myself at times, wondering if I had overestimated my ability to manage it all. Yet, amid the stress, I discovered a hidden strength I didn't know I possessed. I learned how to negotiate bills, budget ruthlessly, and prioritize expenses with a precision I never thought I could muster. Relying solely on myself forced me to develop problem-solving skills, patience, and discipline that felt almost foreign at first, but soon became second nature. Each small victory, paying a bill on time, fixing something myself, even cooking a week's worth of meals, fueled my determination. Also began noticing patterns in my mom's behavior. Her words, her criticisms, and her dismissals were often rooted in fear rather than anger. She worried, controlled, and manipulated because she feared losing influence, not because she hated me. Recognizing this changed the way I approached my own decisions. I stopped internalizing her judgment and started focusing on my growth. But just as I began to feel confident in my rhythm, the first real betrayal hit me, harder than anything I had anticipated. It came suddenly, shaking the fragile stability I had been building and forcing me to question everything I thought I knew about trust. Thought I understood my mom. I thought I knew the limits of her expectations, the lines she wouldn't cross, the ways she would challenge me. But I was wrong. Pause. Her behavior began to shift subtly at first, then more blatantly. She started questioning every decision I made, from how I spent money to how I organized my schedule. Comments that once seemed like concern now carried a sharp edge, as if my independence threatened her sense of control. One evening, the betrayal hit harder than I had imagined. We were having dinner with my older cousin, someone I had always trusted to see both sides. Out of nowhere, she casually remarked, almost with a smirk, that I was irresponsible and that I would never survive without her. My cousin looked at me in confusion, and I felt a hot wave of humiliation. It wasn't just criticism anymore, it was manipulation, and it was happening in front of someone I respected. It became painfully clear that she was spreading doubts, planting seeds of mistrust, and subtly validating her control over me to others. I felt a sharp pang of betrayal, not only from her words, but from the years of trust one had naively invested in her. I realized that manipulation had been there all along, but now it was in full view. I couldn't let her define my life through fear, guilt, or intimidation. I decided then that I needed to protect myself in a way I hadn't before. I began meticulously documenting everything: texts, incidents, financial contributions, even casual conversations that revealed patterns of control. Each note, each record, felt like armor I could wear against doubt and gaslighting. I wasn't collecting proof to retaliate or humiliate her. I was collecting proof to safeguard my independence and demonstrate my competence, both to myself and anyone else who might question my ability to stand on my own. As I compiled the evidence, a strange clarity began to emerge. Independence wasn't just a choice anymore, it was a necessity. The more I documented, the more I understood how much of my energy had been tied up in her control and how much potential I had squandered by trying to meet her expectations. I realized that taking charge of my life required boundaries, discipline, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But then, as I sifted through the records, reviewing months of messages and contributions, I uncovered something that made me pause, a detail that made me question whether I could ever fully trust her again. It was a discovery that threatened to shake the fragile foundation of what I thought I knew about our relationship, leaving me with more questions than answers. Realized that words alone wouldn't be enough to secure my independence. I needed proof, solid, undeniable proof of everything I had done and contributed over the years. I started meticulously gathering evidence, documenting every transaction, every small favor, every contribution that had gone unnoticed. Receipts, bank statements, even notes about the hours I had worked outside the house, all became part of a growing archive that I kept organized in a folder I labeled My Life, My Proof. It felt strange at first, turning my life into a record of accomplishments. I had never thought of my efforts as something tangible to show. But as I flipped through old bills, messages, and notes, I began to see a clear pattern. My contributions had been significant, consistent, and often unacknowledged. Each receipt told a story of my effort, every bank transfer was proof that I had been carrying responsibility quietly, without complaint. Beyond the financial records, I started noting incidents, moments when her criticism disguised fear, times when she manipulated circumstances to make me feel inadequate, and instances when she relied on my work without acknowledgement. It was painful to relive those moments, but seeing them compiled on paper gave me clarity. Patterns emerged. Her words weren't always what they seemed. She tested, she manipulated, and she controlled, but I had the evidence to prove that her assumptions about me were wrong. Friends and even distant relatives had often questioned my ability to manage life on my own. I could see now why they doubted me, they hadn't seen the full picture. But with every note and receipt I gathered, I felt a quiet satisfaction. I wasn't collecting proof to shame anyone, I was building a foundation to stand on my own 2 feet. The act of compiling evidence became empowering. I discovered that acknowledging my own work, recording my own achievements, was a form of self-respect I had ignored for far too long. The more I documented, the more confident I felt. Every entry was a step toward independence, every record a reminder that I could survive and thrive without validation from anyone else. Even mundane details, like covering minor household expenses or handling last-minute errands, took on new meaning as evidence of my capability. I began noticing how much I had internalized responsibility that wasn't fully recognized, and how much strength I had quietly accumulated through those small actions. It also changed the way I viewed my mom's behavior. I started to understand her patterns more clearly. Her criticisms, her attempts to control, even her harsh words, they often masked fear rather than malice. She worried that my independence would diminish her influence or challenge her authority. Recognizing this didn't excuse the manipulation, but it gave me perspective. I was no longer reacting blindly, I was observing, understanding, and preparing. By the end of weeks spent gathering records, I had built a comprehensive picture of my life, proof of my efforts, proof of my resilience, and proof that my independence wasn't just a dream, but a necessity. I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that no one could twist reality to undermine me. The foundation was ready. I was prepared. Just when I felt completely overwhelmed, an unexpected ally appeared, my cousin. They had quietly witnessed my struggles over the years, silently observing the tension and the ways my mom manipulated me. One afternoon, after noticing my frustration and stress, they reached out and offered support I hadn't anticipated. Pause. For the first time, someone outside the immediate conflict confirmed what I had been suspecting for months. My mom's manipulation wasn't normal, it was controlling, intentional, and designed to keep me doubting myself. Their insight was invaluable. They shared advice and resources I had never considered, ways to assert boundaries, strategies to present evidence, and methods to protect my independence without creating unnecessary conflict. Suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I wasn't facing this challenge in isolation. I had guidance, perspective, and validation. Together, we began formulating a strategy. I would present my evidence in a structured, undeniable way. I would assert boundaries calmly but firmly, showing that my independence was non-negotiable. And I would do it without the drama that might have otherwise given my mom power over the situation. For the first time, I realized that I didn't need anyone's approval to validate my life. I only needed proof of my own worth, and the courage to act on it. My confidence surged as we planned. I could see the path ahead with clarity, step by step, each one leading toward independence. I also came to an important realization: my mom's control stemmed from fear, not malice. She feared losing influence, feared being irrelevant, and feared that I would succeed without her guidance. Understanding this didn't make the situation easier, it made it more delicate. I had to assert myself without triggering defensiveness or resentment that could undermine my progress. The timing of my cousin's support couldn't have been more critical. Without their perspective, I might have continued to feel isolated, overpowered, and uncertain. But now, I had the confidence, the evidence, and the plan to finally challenge the status quo. I knew that the next steps I took would be decisive, irreversible even, in defining the dynamic of our relationship, and that's when I realized, what I was about to do next would leave her speechless, altering the balance of power forever, and forcing a confrontation we both had been avoiding for years. I decided it was time to act. After weeks of preparation, reflection, and gathering evidence, I knew I couldn't postpone taking control of my life any longer. With my cousin's guidance, I created a clear, organized outline of everything I had contributed, financially, emotionally, and practically, alongside a detailed plan for how I intended to manage my independence. It was more than just a list, it was a declaration of self-reliance. Setting boundaries became my first priority. I clearly defined what I would and wouldn't tolerate: no interference in my finances, respect for my personal decisions, and acknowledgement of my autonomy. These boundaries weren't arbitrary, they were necessary safeguards for my mental and emotional well-being. I realized that boundaries aren't just rules, they're survival mechanisms that protect your sanity and preserve your self-respect. Began the process of moving out gradually, taking only what I could manage while maintaining stability. Each step, from packing my essentials to securing my own utilities, felt like both a liberation and a test. Managing every bill on my own was daunting, but also exhilarating. Every payment I made, every responsibility I handled, reinforced the fact that I could survive independently. My mom's reaction was immediate and explosive. Denial, anger, and subtle passive-aggressive remarks came in waves, as if my assertion of independence threatened her entire worldview. But I stayed firm. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't apologize for my choices, and I didn't back down. I had rehearsed this moment, prepared my evidence, and built the courage to remain calm and resolute. Each day, as I settled into my new routine, I felt the weight of years of guilt and manipulation lifting. I discovered resilience in myself I hadn't known existed. Patience became a tool, not a weakness, as I navigated conversations, conflicts, and lingering emotional tension. Small victories, a bill paid on time, a meal prepared without anyone's input, a decision made without interference, became symbols of progress and empowerment. For the first time, I felt fully responsible for my own life. I wasn't reacting to her moods, I wasn't trying to appease expectations, and I wasn't tethered by guilt. Independence, which had once felt like a distant dream, now seemed tangible, attainable, and entirely within my grasp. Every small success reinforced my belief that courage, meticulous planning, and consistent effort could create a life I could call my own. But just as I began to savor this newfound freedom, I realized that independence came with its own unexpected challenge. One that would test not only my resolve but my ability to stay true to the boundaries I had worked so hard to establish. As my independence solidified, I began noticing the subtle shifts around me. People who had once doubted my ability to manage life on my own started to recognize the effort and determination I had poured into building a stable, responsible life. Friends, colleagues, and even distant family members began acknowledging what I had accomplished quietly, without fanfare or validation. It was a silent recognition, yet powerful in its effect. My mom's attempts to manipulate and control me slowly lost their power. She realized that I had the evidence, the confidence, and the capability to stand on my own. Her words, once sharp and intimidating, now seemed less effective. It was as if the truth had a quiet, unstoppable force. Each time she tried to assert control, the foundation I had built, my independence, my proof, my self-respect, held strong. I watched as the dynamics in the household shifted. Family members who had supported her doubts began questioning her behavior instead. Her influence weakened, not because I sought revenge, but because reality had a way of revealing itself. The small manipulations and criticisms that once made me second-guess myself were now transparent to others, and the balance of authority quietly realigned. Also noticed something deeper. Karma, I realized, doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it unfolds subtly, like the natural consequences of patterns repeating themselves. My mom's attempts to control and undermine backfired, not dramatically, but enough for her to recognize that influence isn't given, it is earned through respect and mutual understanding. She began to see that my independence wasn't a rejection of her, but a reflection of my growth and resilience. Through all of this, I felt a mixture of relief, pride, and reflection. Betrayal had forced me to become stronger, more self-reliant, and more aware of my own boundaries. Each decision I made to protect myself became a lesson in resilience. I realized that life often rewards preparation, patience, and courage, and that the consequences of our actions, both ours and others, tend to surface in ways we might not expect but are always fair in the long run. Most importantly, I learned that respect must be earned, and manipulation eventually falters when confronted with consistency, evidence, and calm determination. I felt empowered not because I had defeated anyone, but because I had reclaimed control of my own life. Every step, every careful choice, every act of self-respect reinforced that independence was not only possible but deeply transformative. And then came the moment of the final conversation. A confrontation that would solidify everything I had worked toward, forcing acknowledgement, closure, and a reckoning neither of us would forget. The day finally came when I knew I had to face my mom directly. I had gathered months of evidence, rehearsed my words, and prepared myself emotionally for a confrontation that I knew could be tense, emotional, and potentially explosive. This wasn't about revenge, it was about asserting boundaries, reclaiming respect, and finally setting the record straight, invited her to sit down with me in the living room, away from the distractions of daily life. My cousin was nearby, quietly supportive but giving me space to speak. I began by calmly presenting my evidence, receipts, financial records, notes of past contributions, and examples of times when I had quietly handled responsibilities. Each piece was laid out carefully, showing the reality of my efforts, my sacrifices, and the steps I had taken toward independence. At first, she reacted with disbelief. Her eyes narrowed, and she questioned the relevance of every detail. Denial and anger surfaced, as though acknowledging the truth was too painful. But I remained steady, calm, and composed. I didn't raise my voice or respond to provocations. Instead, I spoke with clarity, pointing out facts, patterns, and the reality she could no longer ignore. I reminded her that my independence wasn't a rejection, it was a natural and necessary step in my life. As I continued, I noticed a subtle change in her demeanor. The defensiveness began to waver, replaced by quiet reflection. She listened more than she spoke, and for the first time, I saw recognition, not just of my words, but of my efforts. She didn't say everything I had hoped to hear, but the acknowledgement in her eyes spoke volumes. It was a moment of reckoning, a silent understanding that the power dynamics had shifted. This confrontation didn't magically erase the past. Years of misunderstandings, manipulation, and unspoken expectations couldn't vanish overnight. But it marked a turning point. For the first time, I felt truly equal in the relationship, not submissive, not defensive, but respected as an adult capable of making my own decisions. Every boundary I had established, every act of self-reliance, had finally been validated in a concrete way. The resolution wasn't about dramatic apologies or emotional declarations. It was about presence, acknowledgement, and a quiet, undeniable truth. I had proven my independence, and it could no longer be ignored. I walked away from the conversation with a sense of closure I hadn't imagined possible. I had faced the challenge directly, calmly, and without compromise, and in doing so, I reclaimed my life. And as I looked back on everything, the betrayal, the struggles, the meticulous planning, and the courage to act, I realized that the real victory wasn't proving anything to anyone else. The real victory was proving to myself that I had the strength, resilience, and clarity to define my own life. Independence wasn't just a goal anymore, it was my reality, and nothing could take that away. Looking back now, I understand that the moment my mom told me to pay my own bills was never really about money. It was a turning point disguised as an insult, a challenge wrapped in anger that forced me to confront who I was and who I wanted to become. At the time, it felt cruel and dismissive, but distance has given me clarity. That sentence pushed me into a version of myself I might never have discovered otherwise, learned that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the people closest to us, the ones whose approval we crave the most. That realization was painful, but it was also freeing. It taught me that my worth couldn't be negotiated or measured by someone else's expectations. Worth is built quietly, through consistency, effort, and the courage to stand alone when necessary. Independence didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, unglamorous moments. Paying bills on time. Saying no without explaining myself. Making decisions without seeking permission. Each moment felt insignificant on its own, but together they formed a foundation I could finally stand on. I stopped reacting to guilt and started responding with intention. That shift changed everything. I also learned that boundaries are not punishments. They are not acts of rebellion or rejection. Boundaries are acts of self-respect. They protect your peace when others refuse to. Establishing them was uncomfortable, especially with family, but discomfort was a small price to pay for mental clarity and emotional safety. For a long time, I believed loyalty meant enduring everything quietly, especially when it came from family. I thought love required sacrifice without limits. Now I know that loyalty to yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. When you abandon yourself to keep others comfortable, the cost is always too high. Choosing independence taught me to listen to my instincts, to respect my limits, and to honor my effort without waiting for permission or validation from anyone else. Karma, I realized, isn't always dramatic or loud. It doesn't always look like apologies or public admissions of wrongdoing. Sometimes karma is simply watching control lose its grip. It's seeing manipulation fail when met with calm consistency. It's witnessing doubt dissolve when proof and confidence stand side by side. Truth doesn't rush, but it